depending on who you ask, there's anywhere from about 194 to 207 countries. And this part about depending on who you ask is actually very important, because when we talk about diplomatic recognition, this is going to matter a lot. So as you can see, we already have a lot of countries. So I ask you guys, why do we need another one? Why do we need another country? Innovation, okay.
It's hard to convince existing states to do what you want.
Yep, status quo. New culture. Too little competition.
Most of the countries were set up hundreds of years ago.
Exactly. So these are all very good reasons. And one of the reasons I find very fascinating is what's called the Overton window. So this is the idea that usually when you have elections, most of us live in democracies where we have free exchange of ideas. But you find out that what ends up happening over and over again is you have very, very, very heated debates within a very, very limited window. So I'll give you a perfect example. I'll get to him in a second, right? So usually, for example, okay. Okay, so I'll give you a perfect example of this, right? So usually when we talk about, let's say, Social Security, right? Maybe Democrats say, hey, we should increase Social Security by 5%, or we should decrease Social Security by 5% if you're a Republican. And the debates are always within a very, very, very narrow window. So you only have like even more radical ideas, like ideas proposed by this guy. Who knows who this is? Andrew Yang. So Andrew Yang, I'm surprised you guys know who he is, because he polled very, 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 very poorly. Right? Because his ideas were just kind of too far out there for kind of the regular kind of country's existing paradigms. Tulsi Gabbard is also pretty good, yes. And then so the idea with the network state is that at 3%, the fact that maybe it's not enough to be president of America, and in fact he actually ran for New York and also lost. So maybe he's not enough people. Maybe he doesn't have enough votes to be mayor of New York, but maybe he could start his own country. People who also believe in his ideas. Right? So then so like you have the debates been here, but like his ideas was like way out there. And I also deliberately put it here on this axis and not on the up and down axis, because I think with countries, you can also kind of transcend this whole Democrat, Republican, bipartisan debate. Another idea is kind of like changing the way we think about things. So when I started my company, one of the first choices I had to make was, should it be a for-profit or a non-profit? And I kind of felt like this whole question was kind of based on a false premise, because it's like, okay, what do I want to do? Do I want to make a lot of money, or do I want to help society? But it's like, why not do both? And it's very hard to kind of have something that's a bit of combination of both in the current capitalist, socialist, nonprofit, for-profit ways that most corporate are structured all over the world. Another reason is free mobility. So does anybody know any country in the world that all four of these people can go to? So this is, you know what flag this is? Nigeria. Exactly. So does anybody know any country where all four of these people can go without a visa in Europe? No. No. Oh, maybe. Yes. One of them I think is Northern Turkish Cyprus something, and the other one is Kosovo. And actually, that's actually excluding Nigeria. So Nigeria, every single country requires one. But at least with these other three, there's only two countries, Kosovo and Northern Cyprus, that country, where they can go to without a visa. Right? So free mobility of ideas where, like, imagine if and I do have friends from all of these countries, if I wanted to say, hey, let's all meet up somewhere for a weekend together. In a new country, this kind of thing would be possible. So the first thing when you start a new country, you want to have some sort of manifesto. So I think you were part of the people that were using ChatGPT to kind of write this stuff out. That's a super cool idea. The Declaration of Independence, right? So once you've identified why you're creating your country, you want to have this written down somewhere and codified. So Declaration of Independence is a perfect example of this, but it is flawed, and we'll get to that in a second. Afropolitan is a great example of this. The Zuzalu Declaration, another great example. Nicholas, representing Prospera, also has a really good manifesto. And the thing about these is they're nice. They're what I call very good poetry. Freedom, equality, everyone is equal, yay! But there's a problem, because these are things that sound very nice in theory. But very often when the rubber hits the road, something very different happens in practice. And I say, pay attention to what the gap between what you want to happen and what actually happens. Epistemic gap. I don't know what that word means, but it sounds cool. So Mario Cuomo, which is a New York politician, had a great quote, which is basically, you campaign in poetry, but you govern in prose, which is that when you're campaigning, when you want people to vote for you, you say nice things. Equality, freedom, everybody gets $1,000. But then when it's time to govern, you have to make trade-offs. So prose is kind of like the day-to-day realities of what that means. And I'll give you some examples of this. Who's your country for? So the Declaration of Independence. Does anybody know the paradox in the Declaration of Independence? Or maybe the contradiction, hypocrisy, whatever you want to call it. Exactly. So all men were created equal, but you know what that doesn't apply to? It doesn't apply to you. You could probably qualify. Do you own property? Okay, so you would qualify, you wouldn't qualify, you would qualify, you wouldn't, you might, you wouldn't, I wouldn't, right? So it didn't include men. No, it didn't include women. Even it included men who own property. It didn't include women. It didn't include people of color. And actually, I don't know how many people know this, but there was actually a passage in the Declaration of Independence that said slavery is bad, don't do slavery, that kind of stuff. But there were people who were part of the Declaration of Independence that were funding this that actually owned slaves. And they were like, hey, you know, this whole slavery thing is gonna kind of hurt my bottom line, my profit margin. Can you like take it out? And then Thomas Jefferson said, no, but also you have a lot of money, fine, we'll take it out. So even the very fundamental premise of the Declaration of Independence is also flawed. But fortunately, we've learned our mistakes and we'll never do that again, right? Right? Oh. So Zuzalu, Afropolitan, and Prospera, and I told them beforehand I was gonna not call them out because I love what their mission is, but challenge them. Because in a lot of ways, you know, the Zuzalu Declaration, right? We say inclusive society. Inclusive if you can afford $150 a day for accommodation. Is that really inclusive? Or Afropolitan, where in order to become a citizen, you need to pay about 1.5 ETH floor price. Does anybody know what that is in USD before I go on? About $5,000. So in order to become a citizen, you need to have $5,000. And Prospera, anybody can join Prospera if you're an accredited investor. You're gonna say something?
Yeah, Zuzalu, you don't have to pay money.
You don't?
No, financial assistance. Anyone who couldn't afford it can come for free.
Okay, so this is a good point. So this is kind of where I was driving to next. That right? Interesting. Okay, so I did get the vibe though from on the websites that yes, it's open to everyone, but it's very much catered towards people who have more money. And I was trying, and basically the reason I have these slides up is that kind of challenging us to make sure that we don't basically recreate aristocratic societies. And instead we have something that's more resemblance of a meritocracy, right? So obviously you do need to fund it. So I actually do think it's a good idea to target accredited investors because they will pay for a lot of stuff. However, you should also maybe have more, maybe of a ladder meritocracy, kind of what you were talking about with the financial assistance where maybe 50% of you pay full price. The other 50% of you, maybe if you like, maybe volunteer or help us host workshops or maybe help clean up, you can sort of earn a path to citizenship. So that way you have both capital-based options and also merit-based options. So what goes hand in hand with rights? So we all love to talk about rights. I have a right to free speech and a right to healthcare. But what goes hand in hand with rights? Responsibilities, exactly. There's a great quote from H. Jackson Brown which says that when declaring your rights, don't forget your responsibilities. And then John F. Kennedy's famous quote, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. So I ask you guys right now, if you were to create a new country, how are you gonna provide value?
Actually go to votes.
Vote, okay. That's assuming that democracy is the best form of government, but that's a separate topic.
Or meritocracy is still people voting.
Yep. So Nick, how do you add value to Prospera? Let me ask you this.
I would help, and we all will help with the longevity of our people.
Mm-hmm.
Help the longevity.
Who else? Who else? Yep.
I would say business, organizing, activities, and if there's talks, takeaways the next day for the people who show up.
Build a school. Yes, education is a super important piece. And actually, Nick, it's funny you talk about doing business. 'Cause I think a lot of the value that you provide for Prospera is just talking about it. Right? Like almost everything I've learned about Prospera is through you and like your self-study guide. So I think even like evangelizing, it could be a great way to sort of add value as a citizen of a country. So yeah, so I've talked about this. And then so kind of what I want to talk about here is the intersection between what you want to give the world and what you want from the world. Because it's all about give and change. It's kind of, you want to focus on this part. And there's a Japanese word for this concept. Does anybody know what it's called? Ikigai, exactly. And so kind of what I wanted to do next was like, kind of like a quick group activity is, anybody here who speaks a different language, can they translate Ikigai into your native tongue? Or the idea of a reason for being. Like how would you say that in Mandarin, for example, or German or Austrian? Okay, what does that mean?
The justification for your existence.
Justification for existence. Petra, estar? State of reason kind of thing? German? Brazilian, Portuguese? Razão de ser. What does that mean, literal translation? Reason for being. Anastasia? How do you say this do you speak Russian? How would you say this in Russian? Okay. What's the literal translation for that?
I'm just going to
Google it. Any other languages? Anybody else speak a different language?
look at the characters.
Romanian?
What?
How do you say reason for being in Romanian?
Raison d'être.
Really? That's like French.
I know.
Okay, cool. Yeah, anyway, yeah, so this is the idea that kind of when thinking about your country, you kind of want to have a combination between what you want from your country and how you can provide value to your country. I think another great way is also like having showing people how to contribute. So I think, Dankrad, you're from Ethereum Foundation, right? Yeah, so I think Ethereum Foundation does a great job of this, right? So on their GitHub page, they have this thing called a good first issue. So it's almost like, a lot of people want to contribute, but if someone's new to your community, you want to give them a very step-by-step guide of what they need to do. So on the ethereum.org website or their GitHub page, you can actually see exactly what needs to be done and say, hey, if you're like a newcomer, this is how you can provide value to your community. And the Ethereum Foundation does a great job of this. So like I said, you want 1 cup of purpose, back to the recipe analogy, half a cup of poetry, half a cup of pragmatic prose. You want to have 1 cup of citizenship, preferably capital-based citizens, and then half a cup of merit-based citizens. And then you want to have 1 cup of citizen responsibilities. And actually, I basically gave up on the recipe analogy after this because I ran out of time. But maybe next time I'll add them. Or we can do a recap together. So why start a country? We've talked about this. So study the past, present, and future. If you want to basically understand the importance of studying history, does anybody know the famous quote? Nobody knows this quote. Okay. Yeah, Satiana. Basically, those who cannot learn from history are doomed to repeat it. There's also one of my favorite people of all time, Benjamin Franklin, who says, experience is the best teacher, but a fool will learn from no other. Right? So not everything you have to learn by yourself. You just learn from the experience of other people. What did you say?
There's also one on power, like those who control the past control the present.
I should add that quote for the next time. That's a good one. That's a good point. Because history is actually dictated by runners, isn't it? That's a good point. Study to show thyself approved. This is 2 Timothy 2:15 from the Bible. And then one of my favorite quotes again is, so after Benjamin Franklin, I think it's signed like the Declaration of Independence or one of these things, a lady ran to say, sir, what have you given us? A republic or a monarchy? And he goes, a republic, if you can keep it. And so one of the reasons I love to study history is basically studying republics that were kept for a long time and republics that were kept for the blink of an eye. Who knows what country this is? China, 2000 BCE. So this is a republic, the People's Republic of China, that has been kept for, in some form or another, for the last 4,000 years. On the other end of the spectrum, you have countries like this. Who knows what country this is? Yugoslavia. Yeah, Yugoslavia. So Yugoslavia did not even last a century. All right, so then you have a country like? What? England. England has lasted for, I think, about 1,000 years. On the other hand of the spectrum, you have countries like? Nope. Close, half. Serbia and Montenegro. Serbia and Montenegro did not even last 20 years. It's not even old enough to vote, right? So why do we study history? We study history to understand why is it that some countries have existed for 4,000 years and some countries don't even exist long enough to vote. And then so some...
China existed as a country for that time. I think that's, as a culture, yes.
Yes, you're right. And
There were many times when it was not one country.
exactly. So and this is a good point too, and this is why I put this up here too, because even like if you go back to the example of England, right? Like England didn't exist, like England as we know today has been kind of been very amorphous. But I guess the point I'm driving to is the fact that if you go on Wikipedia, the fact that this shows up as China, whereas it doesn't for another, but also remember too, truth is relative, right? So the social consensus says that China's existed for 4,000 years, and I think that in itself is a very powerful concept.
Well, we just heard that those who control the past control the future. So
Yeah.
it's a strong narrative to make the Chinese people feel like one people.
Yes, and the fact that China has the power to control that narrative is even the point that I'm driving at. Because I'll give another example. Mali. So I was actually going to put up Mali as well, but on the Mali Wikipedia page, they said it only existed since the 1918. But if anybody knows about the Mali Empire, it's actually existed for longer than that, right? But because Mali is not powerful enough, they can't control the narrative to say we've existed for longer than this. So even the power to control the truth is a form of power in itself. Yeah, so these are some great examples of studying the past. So you look at like Will and Errol Durant's Lessons of History, Plato's The Republic, Diane Collins' Hardcore History, Guns, Germs, Steel. I actually have not read this book, but Caroline told me to put it here. Does anybody maybe has read Plato's The Republic and can give us maybe like a key takeaway we can take from this on like how to create new countries?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's exactly what we should not do. But it's, the idea is that there are these ideal forms. Plato, yeah,
It's basically
it's totalitarianism. Basically.
Totalitarianism.
Things like there's a certain ideal state of how it would look like.
Mm-hmm.
And that's like if everyone is sort of doing according to what they're best able to do, right? So you have like warriors, priests, and rulers. Rulers are like the wise people, the worst, and so on and so forth. Then he says the country that's a state that's best according to these eternal truths, that's the best country.
And the philosophers are on top of it,
Yeah.
of course.
Oh, Philosopher King, right? This is like Philosopher King.
That's important.
Why is that important?
I'm a philosopher.
Yeah, and then another one I really like is Will and Ariel Durant's Lessons of History, because this kind of, what it does is that it takes like all these different books and concepts and kind of distills them into like very actionable takeaways. Like one of the takeaways I got from this was that I think capitalism, socialism is like this, it's a very amorphous concept that it kind of goes in and out of fashion. Like you have like intellectual fashion. So like you have a point in time where like capitalism is super popular and everyone thinks capitalism is going to save the world. Then that kind of goes out of fashion because maybe you have too much income inequality. Then socialism becomes popular again, then you kind of go back. So my thing was like, okay, instead of trying to like pick one, just do both. Studying the founders. So I think another great way to learn history is to basically understand the biographies of different people that have ruled throughout society. Does anybody here think they can name every single person on this list? Anybody? Okay, let's try here. Let's start with the easy ones. Lee Kuan Yew. Ho Chi Minh, yes. George Washington. Mao Zedong. Lenin. Someone says Stalin, no, that's Lenin. Okay, now we get a bit harder. Nehru, yes. See, these guys don't know this. This is Kwame Nkrumah. This is Nnamdi Azikiwe. This is who's Brazilian? You should know this. You don't know who it is, okay. Francesca or Francesca? But yeah, he was the first president of Brazil. And then anybody know who this is? I forget the name. I think it's Rattle. So you were talking about examples of what not to do. So not everyone here is actually a positive example. So I'm not putting these on as like what to do. So for example, someone like Nelson Mandela obviously could be considered a good example. What Rattle did was he was the first president of Cuba, and he's the one that signed this thing called the Platt Agreement, which basically gave over Cuba's right to self-sovereignty to America. Right? So all of these people are here as lessons to be learned from, not always lessons of what to do, sometimes of lessons what not to do, but lessons nonetheless. And of course, we forgot Vitalik, yes, Zuzalu. Long live Zuzalu.
I feel like with the book section, you can also add Why Nations Fail.
I was gonna add that too. So I have not actually read this book, but I've heard a lot about it. What is like the key takeaway from that book for you?
It's like that institutions matter.
Mm.
Right, institutions like provide public services that provide the rule of law and property rights and stuff.
Institutions matter.
Yeah, I think, because I read this like 10 years ago, but what I remember from it is concepts around vicious cycles and
Mhm.
virtuous cycles and how that is necessary to be implemented in economic institutions. So the value of the democratic paradigm between government and the capital infrastructure.
And I think while studying the past, while studying founders, I think it's also super important to also study the supporting cast, right? So it's not always don't always like glorify the individuals. Also pay attention to the people behind the scenes that made a lot of this stuff possible. So again, let's see who can do this. Really? Nobody knows? Yeah, Deng Xiaoping. Gandhi. Okay, now we get a bit harder. Anybody know who this guy is? Ara Benz, president of Guatemala. Obafemi Awolowo, first president or minister of finance of Nigeria. Anybody know who this is? Ellen Sirleaf Johnson. So she was not one of the first, but the first like democratically elected president of Liberia. So all of these people, if you want to start a country, you should basically get very familiar with their story. And of course, we can't forget the supporting cast of Zuzalu. So we have Lawrence Ion. Lawrence. Hey. Nicole, Vincent, Vitalik, of course, and Milos. So all of these people are, so while we talk about Vitalik, we should also talk about the supporting cast as well. Studying the present. So I think in addition to studying what's happened in the past, it's very important to also study what's currently going on in your society. Nicholas has an amazing landscape of all the different countries that are kind of trying to be created, new cities, network states in some form or another. And I think that if you're trying to start a country, you should basically be familiar with what all of these people are doing. Again, not all of them are perfect, but you can use them as examples of what to do and what not to do. Another great example is, of course, the canonical book, The Network State by Balaji. But people don't know this. Before The Network State, there was a video he did at the Y Combinator startup school called Silicon Valley, The Ultimate Exit. Yes, that was my next question. Do you know how long ago? 2013. You were there. Do you remember the vibe? What did he say? Do you remember what he was saying about this back then? Yeah. So it's kind of interesting, like a lot of these ideas are not always new. Even Balaji has always had this idea since 2013, right? But kind of just gradually finding the right narrative, finding the right words to use, having more status, it now basically found more mainstream appeal. So definitely encourage you guys to watch that video. Also, I think while studying, we shouldn't get too high on our own supply, as the saying goes. We should also look into the critiques of network states. I think Primavera de Felipe and then someone else has I actually haven't listened to the podcast, but I think we should probably just talk about it. Has a thing called the problems with the network state. And I think if you do want to start a network state, you should pay a lot of attention to the critiques. Like one of the things that's talked about in this podcast is that network states, they kind of rely on like the privilege of exit and autonomy. So like a lot of us are very mobile citizens. So if you don't like the Canadian government, American government, we can just go somewhere else, right? So why vote when I can just leave? I can just leave. If I don't like, I'll just leave. But a lot of the people don't have this privilege, right? So when we're creating these networks, and actually in Balaji's talk, he talks a lot about voice versus exit and how if we don't like something, we can just leave, hard fork. But again, a lot of people don't have the privilege to just up and move to somewhere else. Who?
Primavera de Felipe is
Really?
workshop, May 8 to 12, and that's the internal one, and the external one is May 15 to 19.
So Primavera and Balaji in the same room. Is that gonna be on pay-per-view? That would be very fun. I think we should actually try to have them have like an intellectual debate or conversation. That would be amazing. Yeah, so again, anyway. Studying the future. So this is one of my favorite topics now. I think I'm gonna talk about this a bit more later on, but I feel like sometimes don't just be, and this is why I love the Synthetic Blockchain Meets Bio conference. Not every day be completely logged into the day-to-day practicalities. Sometimes just dream big. Have crazy ideas, and whether or not it's possible, who cares? Just be ambitious, be optimistic, the world is amazing. Study the future. Does anybody know where this place is? Singapore, yeah, I think Super Trees in Singapore. What did you say? Okay, I'm glad you said this. I'm glad you said this because literally, so while I was preparing for this presentation, right? So one thing I tell, one of my pieces of advice is to, when you guys go home, just Google the word solar punk. You will have your mind blown away by the kind of things that you'll find there, right? It's just a great way to sort of just become more optimistic and get ideas about the future. I'm so glad you said this is real because literally as I was Googling this, I saw the Singapore Super Trees and I was like, wait, I thought solar punk was supposed to be about science fiction. Is that a real place? And I was even asking myself, I'm like, wait, is it a real place? Because I thought it was real, so what's it doing here? I was literally surprised just like you were now. And I think this is the beauty of kind of what studying the future is good about because then the lines between what is science fiction and what's nonfiction kind of gets blurred. And then you kind of realize that a lot of things that are written in books are more realistic than you would call it. Which is why I say, so a perfect example of this is, does anybody know what movie this is from? Yes, Black Panther, Wakanda. So Wakanda is a fictional movie, right? It's not a real place, right? It's not a real place. Well, so there was an architectural digest that basically said, hey, this is what it would look like if it was a real place. And then, to make it even weirder, the USDA accidentally listed Black Panther as a real place. So, yes. So like when you like maybe want to like do tariffs, like calculate like tariffs on importing stuff, they put Black Panther as like maybe like a test like variable, and they forgot to remove it. And I was like, well, just leave it there. Why not? But this kind of just speaks to the fact that the mouth is a powerful thing. Once you put something out into existence, it kind of just becomes a little bit true in people's minds. Which is why I think we should rebrand science fiction to science futures. All right? All right? Yeah, so then another thing I was going to say is start brainwashing yourself. I think brainwashing yourself is so underrated. I mean, we're all being brainwashed all the time, just being intentional about it, right? I think we can choose to read dystopian novels or just read utopian novels about how the world is so amazing and everything is perfect. And then eventually you believe it. And then eventually it becomes true. A perfect example of this is Margaret Atwood. So Margaret Atwood has a course. I haven't taken it, but I'm just like recommending for you guys to check it out, about practical utopias, right? Talking about how can we make utopias real. Another thing I like about her is she should be the poster child of longevity. She is 83 years old. She's on Twitter. She's on Substack. And she's even trolling people on Twitter. And I think that is the hallmark of longevity, right? Like yes. Youthful humor. I love it. I love it. Does anybody know what book this is? Does anybody know what other book he wrote? Brave New... Okay, I did not know about that, yes, but maybe that too. Brave New World. And the funny thing about Aldous Huxley is that everybody knows about Brave New World, right? The dystopian where everything goes wrong. Few people know about Island, which is a more utopian book. Another example, who knows about Dante? What book did Dante write, the famous book about Dante? Exactly. That's what everybody knows, but nobody talks about Paradiso, paradise, right? This is to show you that we've been fed so much negativity and dystopian propaganda. Pardon me?
It's very boring compared to the...
Maybe that's part of it too, right? That dystopian kind of like scratches that Schadenfreude in us. We want to see destruction, but it still speaks to the fact that there's a lot of optimism in the world, but we've just been fed so much negativity propaganda.
Lord of the Flies. Mm-hmm. It's a true story, but the true story is that the kids actually get along and they form a great community.
Yeah. That's a good point. I actually learned that for the first time, even a couple days ago. Even this book, I only found out about it because Sean was reading this book. And he's like, hey, you know Dante's Inferno? Well, he also wrote a book called Paradiso. And this is about literally the 7 stages of heaven. And what Sean says is that the whole premise of the book is that the first stage of heaven is like, wow, this is so amazing. And then it's like, this is even more amazing. This is even more amazing. And so, moral of the story, brainwash yourself with positive propaganda. Future, right? So another super cool thing to talk about is future forms of governance and economics and things like this. Maybe, do you know how futarchy works? Yeah. Okay, so maybe you can explain it, and I'll try to give a little high-level overview. But, so, while talking about the future, again, thinking beyond this whole paradigm, we were talking about voting, right? What if there's a better form of government than voting? Robin Hanson has a great quote where he says, vote values but bet beliefs. So vote for whatever you want, but then bet on what outcomes you think would actually be the best. Can you maybe give a quick explanation of how futarchy works?
Yeah, so the idea is that you have prediction markets that decide on who gets to make decisions or have positions of responsibility, right? So, and prediction markets are basically a betting mechanism. So, and then there's mechanisms like conditional prediction markets where, hey, if this person gets elected, the GDP of the country will increase by X. Right, and this gives people a better incentive to, make accurate predictions for who's going to perform well.
Exactly. So these are all ideas that, in the current paradigm of, Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative, probably cannot happen. But if you're making a new country, why not? Bet on whatever policy you think is the best. And actually, Vitalik wrote a blog post about this in 2014. So again, these ideas are not new ideas. We just need new mindset to approach them. Now we're going to talk about growth, digital growth. Yes, so the first thing we want to do is, if you want to grow a country, the first thing you want to do is build digital relationships. Okay, now do people know who these two people are? Mao Zedong and Kwame Nkrumah. Remember the name. Also, another thing I did too, I didn't mention this, was that I deliberately tried to pick politicians from all over the world, because I think a lot of times when we study history, again, history is written by the winners. Between UK, US, maybe Germany, Netherlands, they pretty much colonized everyone, so most of the history we know is European history. I think it's super important to study African history, East Asian history, South American history as well. So anyway, Kwame, when he was trying to build his country, Ghana, he went to go visit Mao Zedong in China to build a digital relationship, because they were both trying to create new countries from scratch. And it's like, hey, I'm trying to start a new country, you're trying to start a new country, let's work together. And then so again, Nicholas is actually a great example of this, right? So I noticed one thing that Nicholas always does is that whenever he talks about Prospera, he'll usually give a shout out to Afropolitan as well, or the one in Zanzibar, what's that one called? Hayden, right? So it's like, in such early stages, it makes no sense to compete. Like you're barely relevant enough to compete, so just kind of work together to kind of build goodwill and work together as a team. Digital memes. Memes are a very, 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 very powerful concept, right? Like the fact that I can put this picture up here and everybody knows exactly what politician I'm talking about with just a hat shows you the power of memes. Everybody knows if you see the red eyes. I think you have a red eye too on Telegram, don't you? Right? So this basically shows you the power of memes, which is that people have very short attention spans. I can, rant and write a Twitter thread about why my country's so great, or I can just drop a funny meme and get the point across right away. Another great example of memes, right? So I was like, I Googled this photo, and apparently, does anybody know when this photo came out? So I think there was like a I don't remember the year, but there was like a G8. So Russia's part of the G8, but I guess they got kicked out because of sanctions and stuff. So then there's a G7 summit. And then basically they were having a meeting without Putin there. So then this picture kind of magically appeared on the internet of him horseback riding on a mountain with his shirt off right around the same time, right? And then it became a meme, right? But it's a meme that kind of propagates this idea of Putin being a strong person and great and all that kind of stuff. So, you can use memes to your advantage. Mark Zuckerberg basically does this thing where he like strategically positions himself so he looks taller than he actually is. And then, of course, who can forget about Fitz Vitalik? So another really good book about this is Public Relations, right? So basically, this guy, Edward Bernays, basically talks about the art of shaping public opinion. Has anybody read this book? Okay, anybody else? Do you want to maybe tell us, like, the key takeaway?
Yeah, I mean, it's about propaganda, right? That's where the name comes from. And, well, he's talking about how to do it for companies and for governments, right? And I think the core narrative is that you aren't like talking about your product, but you're creating about like a major change that's going on, like a big trend that's going on in the world that's kind of affecting your audience, or you're suggesting you develop narrative control that it affects your audience, and that sort of, naturally without you telling them points at your solution to overcome it.
Who thinks propaganda is bad? You guys don't think propaganda is bad? But the Soviet Union did propaganda. Isn't that bad? Okay, so you don't think propaganda is bad. Exactly. It depends. Exactly. Propaganda is just a tool. And then, like, I'm probably going to use a different word when I talk to, like, mainstream people, because I feel like propaganda is so entrenched as a bad thing. But I think every day we're all getting propaganda. Zuzulu, Montenegro, freedom, everything is propaganda. Just pick one that you like and that you think is actually beneficial for society. A great example of this is, does anybody know this? Really? BTS. And everybody know who this is? Nicki Minaj. BTS Army and Nicki Minaj Barbies. Some of the biggest stands you can ever meet. Like, these are the people that, like, they push so much, I guess you could call it maybe harmless propaganda, but like their fans push out so much content. Like, if you want to push a movement, study what they do and just copy that.
BTS provides 2% GDP for South Korea.
2% GDP for South Korea. That's crazy. Music. They make music. That's the thing. These are just music artists. Make lots of content, right? So I think Nicholas did this with Prosperous Self-Study Guide. But then BTS is super impressive too, because BTS is K-pop. They are Korean. They don't speak English. They don't make music in English, none of that stuff. But their army is so passionate about them that they basically have decentralized content marketing. So study how they did it and just copy that formula. Cloud first. So I think, what was I going to talk about here? Yeah, so digital physical hybrid. So we've talked about digital growth. Now we're going to transition to the place where we have digital and physical growth kind of blending together. So there was a talk last week during synthetic biology where Nick Tikhonov basically gave a talk about how, to start a country, you want to transition from like basically online interactions and gradually transition from online interactions to meetup, conferences, co-living, eventually become a network state. And actually, I found a perfect example of this. So I was going through my Twitter DMs and I saw something. Does anybody recognize, it's too pixelated. Does anybody know who this is? Huh? No, this person here. One of the organizers. Yeah, cool. And look at the date, August 2022. Before I even knew anything about Zuzulu, before I knew who Nicole was, I knew about Inoko Club because, and this is a DM I sent to my friend, I'm like, yo, who are these people and how do they make Vitalik and Sergey Brin? And now, so then when you play them, it makes sense now why Nicole is a perfect person to be an organizer for Zuzulu. She has experience with this stuff already. Right, and then he said the exact same thing, you know, like they're very well connected, they go to every conference, holding a crypto hacker house in South Korea. So this is basically the seeds of Zuzulu was kind of already planted a year ago before this. Eche, who is the partner of Chica, before he started doing Afropolitan, they were hosting meetups for like black techies in like San Francisco, right? So if you want to try to grow a network state, you know, don't come out and just say, hey guys, I'm starting a network state. You're gonna scare people away. Hey, we're doing a hacker house. Hey, we're doing a meetup. Hey, we're doing a party. Yeah, just come, we'll have some drinks, we'll be fun, whatever. And then eventually you build an audience of people, you build their trust, and then eventually you realize, hey guys, now we're starting a network state. So people bring this up to me often, even when I talk to my family back home, and they, hey Tom, are you sure you're not in a cult right now? And I could deny, but I could say, okay, prove to me that you're not in a cult. Right? Everything that we believe in has cultish behavior. I guess the difference is that, is it benefiting you and do you have agency? I can leave whenever I want. Building physical relationships. Again, I go back to how Kwame Nkrumah and Mao Zedong working together. Economic sustainability. How will this make money? Yeah, so basically these are the different ways I can make money: consumption-based taxes, subscription-based property tax, investors educate. So one idea I find really fascinating is the concept of a harbinger tax. So I don't know if some of you remember on Friday, a lady was talking here about, hey, you know, it's really hard to get housing in Zuzulu and Lustica Bay. What if we created a black market for housing? And there's actually an economic precedent for this called a harbinger tax. And the way it can kind of work is that, think about it as a layer 1 and a layer 2 blockchain, right? So Lustica Bay Montenegro is the layer 1. So they're providing the security layer. Zuzalu is the layer 2, so they're providing housing on top of like the land. You could have residents that pay maybe a fixed cost of like, so whatever Zuzulu's paying, we just pay the same amount. But then you could have guests that could come in and basically bid on how much they want to pay. So they could say, hey, look, I'm willing to pay $150 to stay here for every week. Then someone else could come in and say, hey, look, you know what? I'm actually willing to pay $200 to stay here. So they could basically kick this person out at the end of the week or transfer it over to them at the end of the week. And then the profit margin could basically flow to where in Zuzalu, and that could be the tax revenue. So this is basically how a harbinger tax works. And this is kind of a way that Zuzulu could fund itself through property taxes despite not actually being like a registered legal entity in Montenegro. Yeah, so this is like a bit more complicated. And then yeah, we could even throw in NFTs, throw in a DAO, maybe say zero knowledge in there, you know, just throw in all the buzzwords. Subscription-based taxes, right? So my friend Andy, shout out to Andy, he pitched an idea that, you know, what if like taxes could work more like subscription? Like, you know, you can subscribe to Netflix, you use it, and when you're bored, you just kind of move away from it, right? So I kind of basically took like a bootstrap on pricing, like you use for like maybe a SaaS product and say, hey, the same way you can subscribe to SaaS products on like a tiered basis, want to subscribe to a citizenship the same way, right? So you could do a percentage-based tax system, you could do a fixed dollar amount tax-based system, et cetera. Another example is corporate sponsorships, right? So I think when the idea of corporate sponsors was brought up, I think on Friday, Vitalik said, hey, should we take on corporate sponsors? And people were like, no, we shouldn't. And my personal opinion is that it's almost inevitable because eventually someone will come up with a bag of money that is almost too much to turn away. So I think instead of avoiding it, kind of just figure out, okay, if we were to take on corporate sponsors, what would that look like, right? So this example here, you have the French national team where, you know, it's sacred. You know, we would never sully the jersey with capitalism. We would never put a sponsored jersey on there. And then guess what happens? They just find a workaround. They put it on the practice jerseys. All right, so it's very hard to turn away a big bag of money is kind of the point I'm making. So if you're going to take this bag, just ask yourself, how are you going to do it without sacrificing your morals? There's Thomas Sankara has a great quote where he says, he who feeds you controls you. Right? So you want to be very intentional about picking your corporate sponsors so you don't end up like, remember the example I gave earlier on about the slavery passage being removed from the Declaration of Independence? So another example of, for example, like what this would look like if we took on a corporate sponsor and how we could misalign incentives. So you remember during this event, we put our manifesto into ChatGPT and it gave us a thing. Now, what if instead of ChatGPT, what if Google was our sponsor and Google said, hey, don't use ChatGPT, use our AI thing to help you write your manifesto. And it gave something that was kind of maybe misaligned. Or another great example, does anybody remember his name? Arbenz, Prime Minister of Guatemala. So this is why you want to be very careful about who your corporate sponsors are. This banana basically killed this guy. How? Okay, so America, United Fruit Company, which is basically the predecessor to Chiquita Bananas. Does anybody know Chiquita Bananas? Yeah, so you guys know them, Americans. Yeah, so basically, prior to that, United Fruit Company. So what he did was that he basically said, hey, we're gonna nationalize all of our agriculture so that the money actually flows back into us. United Fruit Company said, whoa, we wanna make money. We're not gonna make money if you do that. So they basically lobbied the CIA to overthrow him and bring democracy to Guatemala, and then he got killed and stuff like this. So again, you have to be very careful about what kind of corporate sponsors and how profit and politics are playing together. Yeah, so this was the flag of United Fruit Company before it became Chiquita. Physical memes, yes. So we've talked about digital memes. If you want to grow your country, you also want to have physical memes. Does anybody know kind of maybe the perfect example of what a physical meme would be? Landmarks, exactly. Statues, landmarks, things like Kara has Landmark Down that kind of talks about this actually. Yeah, you can ask her about that afterwards later. Actually, maybe, how much time do we have? Oh, we're over. Okay, yeah. So I'll just quickly go through. Yeah, so perfect examples of, but these cost a lot of money. So if you can't afford to do something like this, you could do something really simpler and just do a rubber ducky. And what do you notice about all these people? What are they doing? Taking pictures. You know what that means? They're tourists. You know what tourists mean? Revenue. Yeah, so this is another thing. So it says the most Instagrammable cafe in Morocco. So even though it's a physical location, they kind of went digital first and said, okay, yes, we're a physical cafe, but realistically, most people are going to see us online before they see us in real life. Let's just optimize for Instagram. Economic sustainability. So maybe I'll just say a couple more stuff. So I think if you want to start a country, basically you have all these ways of making money. Where do you want to keep your money? And you kind of have two options, right? You can either basically control the money printer yourself, or you can use money that's not controlled by anyone. What you don't want to be is in between right here, which is basically money that's controlled by a government, but it's not yours, right? So for example, you have the US where they have their own money printer, and that's good for them. You have money that's controlled by no one here. Then you have Montenegro, which is they use the euro, but they're not in the EU. Or you have the Central African franc, which is basically, I think, 8 African countries that are using money that's controlled by France in the euro. Social services, I'm almost done, by the way. Some social services, so we talk about universal basic income. Again, so instead of debating how much to increase Social Security by, you could just give everybody $1,000 and let them figure out how they wanted to do this. So one of the problems this would solve is that it would basically solve the divide between public and private schools, right? So basically every school would be a private school, but it would also be like a public private school because then everyone can afford to go to a private school level of education. And the schools that were not offering good education quality would just go bankrupt. Healthcare, not medicine. So Robin Hanson talked about this, and you can check out the notes on this one later on. But the idea that basically you could basically just create like an insurance market. And then defense. So the final example I'll give here is, does anybody know what's special about Japan's army? It's Japan's, exactly, it's a self-defense army. So Japan has a population of 80 million people, but they don't have an army. How is this possible? Well, they kind of realized, well, after the World War II, but also they realized, we don't need our own army. We can just like partner up with the US and they can be our army for us. And so if you wanted to start a country, you don't actually necessarily need your own military defense force. You could, yes. So yeah, you're right. So yeah. So it's yeah, it is. It's 1% of GDP. Yeah. So I put it in quotes, but what I'm trying to propose to you is that it's not far out of norm to think that, hey, you could just not have an army and just contract other people to do your defense for you. And to maybe build redundancy, you can maybe contract it out to maybe the US and China. So that way, if US decide to rug you, just use China's military.
So should you then use the US as its army?
Yeah, why not? US and China. And maybe like Russia as well. Do that too. Gain diplomatic recognition, yes. So the final point here was just talking about, so remember what I said earlier on about how, depending on who you ask, there's between 195 to 207 countries. You don't need to convince everyone that your country is really a country. Just start by convincing one person, then 2 people, then maybe convince FIFA, then convince the Olympics, and then eventually, you're a country. And make friends. Yes, I talked about this already, making friends. And then I think the most important part of a country, and this is more of a spiritual, optimistic, poetic note, is that, are you growing as a person? Asking yourself, have I self-actualized? Have I reached my full potential? Am I actually a better person by being here? And then also asking yourself, have you grown collectively? So in addition to growing as an individual, have you made the people around you better as well? I think because life is all about growing yourself, but also growing other people. And then if you do all of this stuff, you put this all in a big bowl, you mix it together, what do you have? A country. Thank you.